Honourable member for Windsor-Tecumseh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As you know, as you're aware, Bill C-14 now goes to third reading, and that gives the Senate 2 days to consider it before the June 6th deadline. And while I acknowledge the government's expressed desire to get this bill passed before the Supreme Court's June 6th deadline, I think most people agree that this is just too important of a piece of legislation to rush, especially considering that in its present form it's not likely to pass constitutional muster. On this, I second NDP Justice critic Murray Rankin when he says, "I cannot accept passing a bill that I know to be unconstitutional." The key flaw of C-14 is the end-of-life requirement, the reasonably foreseeable natural death. This is the part that conflicts with the Supreme Court, which didn't require terminality or end of life, and therefore, according to the Carter decision, infringes on the charter rights of all those who have a grievous and irremediable condition that causes them intolerable suffering, but aren't dying as a result. The Canadian and Quebec Bar Associations and various other legal experts, and now the Alberta Court of Appeals, have said that this requirement conflicts with the Supreme Court. Medical groups don't like it either. The body that represents every provincial medical regulator has come out against it as too vague for doctors to follow. Now, the NDP put forward a number of amendments that would have improved this bill tremendously, and had they not been rejected, the bill would likely have a better shot of making it through the Senate. We suggested removing this controversial end-of-life requirement, which is almost certainly unconstitutional, and replacing it with the exact words that the Supreme Court used in their decision, and the Liberals rejected that. Of more than 100 amendments moved, just 16 were accepted, and they were mostly minor technical clarifications. The NDP did manage to secure agreement on 2 amendments that were introduced and adopted unanimously, and that was clarifying conscientious objection rights and adding a stronger commitment to palliative care. As criticism grows against their bill, the government increasingly falls back on the excuse of a deadline imposed on us by the Supreme Court, and this isn't exactly true. The court said that they would give federal, provincial governments a year to put in place more complex regulatory regimes should they choose. On June 6th, an exemption is open in 2 criminal code offenses for patients and physicians acting within the guidelines the court set out in their Carter decision. There isn't a vacuum, and to be blunt, murder won't become legal, but nor will medical aid in dying return to being illegal without a federal law in place. Over the past year, every provincial medical regulator has developed guidelines for medical aid in dying that physicians must follow. These safeguards are very close to the safeguards proposed in Bill C-14. Federal leadership is necessary to ensure that access is equitable across Canada and prevent a patchwork, but it's not strictly necessary to ensure basic access right now. Therefore, this final push to get this bill through the House is most unfortunate, and it's not the outcome we'd hoped for. The NDP worked long days in good faith with other parties, but it's better than passing a flawed bill defying the Supreme Court and infringing on the charter rights of suffering Canadians, which prompted this legislative response in the first place. For us, this isn't a partisan issue. We've collaborated with all parties from the start on this, and will continue that constructive approach, especially when it comes to championing the causes for our health care and palliative care We had a chance to get this bill right, but the government doesn't seem interested in listening at this point. I think it's important here to step back and reflect on how we got to where we are now. In February of 2015, a unanimous Supreme Court ruling established the charter-protected right of competent adult Canadians experiencing enduring and intolerable suffering as a result of grievous and irremediable medical conditions, including a disease, disability, or illness, to access medical assistance in dying. In February of 2015, the Supreme Court unanimously decided in Carter v. Canada that Canadians who are suffering intolerably because of a grievous and irremediable medical condition have a charter-protected right to access medical assistance in dying. The effect of the ruling was suspended until June 6th of 2016. The reports of an interprovincial task force and a federal expert panel, as well as a wide array of witness testimony, were considered by a joint special committee of Parliament, resulting in 21 recommendations on a legislative response to Carter. We succeeded in adding major actionable recommendations on palliative care to that report. And this issue of palliative care is what, for myself, goes directly to what I object to most about C-14 in its current state. Should this government rush into a law like a bill like C-14 without also having a plan to shore up and extend palliative care? The answer is, of course, most emphatically no. It should not. As noted in the recent report by the Canadian Cancer Society, Right to Care, Palliative Care for All Canadians, there are gaps in palliative care across the country. And as my colleague mentioned in her speech, it's very heart-wrenching to know some of the stats and facts about what is actually available right now in palliative care for Canadians. And it's an epic fail for this government to be putting forward a bill while at the same time ignoring the real, tangible details that we need to give us confidence as we move forward in a future with medical-assisted dying. That was so insensitive. About 45% of cancer patients die in acute care hospitals, even though most Canadians prefer to die at home. Not only are acute care settings more costly than dedicated palliative care, they're also not equipped to provide the most appropriate care to palliative care patients and their families. Palliative care can increase the efficient use of our public health care dollars, but increased care outside a hospital setting can place undue financial hardship on family caregivers. Healthcare costs tend to increase substantially in the months and weeks before death due to increasing frailty and dependence on healthcare services. We believe that this government should take a lead in providing appropriate funding for palliative care. Improving palliative care in all settings, including outside the hospital, should result in more efficient use of healthcare dollars. But there will be upfront costs to facilitate change. Federal and provincial territorial governments should work together to establish a financing plan and create a national palliative care transition fund to ensure the changes needed to improve palliative care in Canada can take place. When I look at the latest version of C-14, it states that it commits to working with provinces, territories, and civil society to facilitate access to palliative care and end of life. Whether it's Alzheimer's and dementia, appropriate mental health supports and services, culturally and spiritually appropriate end-of-care supports for Indigenous patients. Now, it is all well and good, but precise commitments need to be committed to, and this bill is quite vague. The only other time palliative care is mentioned in the bill is this enactment provides for a parliamentary review of its provisions of the state of palliative care in Canada to commence at the start of the 5th year following the day on which it receives royal assent. On the 5th year, this seems to me to be way too far in the future. Canadians of all political persuasions and faiths, indeed Canadians of goodwill everywhere, deserve something more definite and concrete than a promise to review palliative care within 5 years. This is all more disappointing, given that the government could have addressed this issue in its recent first budget. as it knew that we would soon be debating C-14. But as we know, not a single dollar was earmarked for palliative care measures. We should have fortified health care, palliative care, home care before we crafted C-14. It would have alleviated our anxiety on what the future holds.